Recording. Okay. Yeah, hello. Hey guys. So this will be I am Nathaniel. I'm with my good friend Houston Thomas. Houston, where are you right now?
I am in the basement of my pastor's house, Fillmore, Kentucky, right
Wilmore,
outside of
Kentucky.
Asbury University.
I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. Um so this will be the first in a new thread of content. And today we'll be looking at poignant events in our day and just have a conversation about our place in the church and in society. And yeah, Houston, you want to start off with giving us an overview, like just a quick summary of what's going on, what you're seeing right now across the country?
Yeah, well, obviously we all saw, or most of us have saw the video of those cops. I consider all of them a participant in the murder of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And basically, it's just really, I feel like that was like a clear-cut example of the systematic and individual racism that exists in our society, specifically in America. And as a result, not just the African American community, but a lot of other races have, they're supporting the protesting and this movement that has emerged from that disgusting incident where, it's like, it's being silent. That's not that's not enough anymore. It's time for our voices to be lifted up, and also for other races to humble themselves before the African American community and be honest about the things we don't know and ask questions, and to actually feel the hurt, the frustration, and the anger that this racism that permeates our society has done to the African American community. So you invited me to kind of represent, I guess, the white community, and maybe
not represent, no.
or
Just you.
Or just me, yeah.
I mean, whether you want to be a representative or an ambassador of your community, that's up to you. I called you here to hear you. Yeah.
Dude, and I'm excited.
Yeah.
Because I'm also excited to learn, to hear from your perspective too, because you are Asian. You are not a born citizen here in America. You're from Malaysia. So I know that you have a different perspective.
Yeah. How long has it been since I came to the States? I think it's been about 4 years now.
4 years.
Yeah, 4 years. A lot has changed, and
man, our friendship has changed.
It's been quite an experience. Yeah.
Also, Nathaniel, can I just say something before we start?
Go ahead.
I just want to let everyone who's listening or hearing this talk, this discussion, I think, this is a conversation. I don't know everything. And I'm not going to know everything. I don't know how it feels to be an African American and to be on that side of this situation. But I'm more than willing to share what I may be perceiving or what I may know, and to also ask questions. So I'm excited again, but just know that I don't know everything. And I think everyone knows that I don't know everything.
Yeah, both of us are in the same boat. We don't claim to know everything. And in this conversation, we're just taking this opportunity to say what we do know and to share what we think and to ask questions, even questions that we don't have the answers to even today, that we can't get the answers to anytime soon. But we'll ask those hard questions, questions that will probably take a few years to answer. But that's the purpose of this conversation. Yeah. So let's let's get off the launching pad and with this question. I'm curious, how was your initial response, like at the beginning of all this, when you first hear about the news, the case of George Floyd, and then the subsequent public outrage and how everyone is reacting or responding? How was your initial response or approach to this this whole audio?
I got to see the video before the protests and riots emerged from the incident. And when I was watching the video, it was just like just so grueling to watch. It's very hard to watch. I'm probably not the only one that's holding their breath the whole time. Because literally there's a man, an African-American man, who literally cannot breathe. And this officer with this, like, I don't know, the expression on his face, it's like he felt like he was in control and he could do what he wanted. And in that incident, yeah, he kind of did. And what happened? The man died. And it was terrifying. It was just not, it was just so, like I said, grueling to watch. But whenever I started to see the news, the news has a tendency to just show the negative consequences of the protesting. And kind of what they showed was, the looting or the vandalizing or the violence that has resulted in these protests. And it was just different this time, though. It was completely different because before, and I'm sure most white people are in the same boat as me, whenever they showed protests, the news, they kind of just highlighted the violent actions that are being taken. And this is a typical response. I understand racism is a problem, but there's no need for violence. Duh, we get that. Like, yes, absolutely. But I think that's a really, really, what's the word? A low approach, kind of an ignorant approach. And I think my approach was ignorant because basically what I was doing is I was saying, yeah, I guess that's a problem, but there's no need for violence. And I was acknowledging that there was a problem, but I really wasn't understanding the full extent of the problem. Now, with this protest, obviously, there's violent acts that are taking place. But it wasn't like, hey, I understand there's a problem, but the violent acts are unnecessary. It was more like, wow, I can just sense the hurt, the anger, the fear, the frustration that the African American community is dealing with, because this is a perpetual problem. It happens all the time. Systematic racism and individual racism is a perpetual problem in our American society. So this time around, even though as a believer, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't believe violence is the answer. I don't believe violence will ever be the answer. But this time around, I want everyone to know, especially the African American community, to know that, like, even though I don't believe violence is the answer, I can see through what's happening your frustration. I can see the fear that racism and the racism within the law enforcement has caused within the African American community. So I'm not really focusing on the violence, even though I do want to say again, I don't support violence. Really what I'm focusing this time around is lending my ears, my mouth, my heart, and my hands to the African American community to help abolish this disgusting sin that's infiltrating our society.
Yeah, you definitely touched on the next thing that I was curious about, because the question of how has your approach changed? Because you put out a video on Facebook about your experience in downtown Lexington and how your perspective has changed.
Yeah.
And you definitely reached out with a compassionate heart. Do you want to share a little bit of what you share on that Facebook video?
Yeah, like, you know, like I mentioned earlier, like, even whenever I was witnessing the protests this time around, God was already stirring something in my heart. He was already showing me kind of the extent of like what's actually happening in terms concerning racism that exists in our society. But it kind of really became real to me whenever I was in downtown Lexington. I was hanging out with some friends. I was not a part of the protest. There was a protest that was occurring. I always like to mention it wasn't a protest of just African Americans. It was a diverse group of people, diverse in religion, race, background, culture, just everything. It was a very diverse group of people. And they were marching through the streets. They weren't disturbing those who were in their cars. They weren't assaulting police officers. They were just marching throughout the streets. And it was actually very like wow, like I've never witnessed this before. Cars honking, people just speaking truth, advocating justice for George Floyd. And then, because there's a courthouse right on my left side, they came and circled the courthouse, and they came right through wherever I was sitting. And at the very beginning, this white man came and they flipped chairs, they flipped tables, pushed trash cans, just making a mess, trash everywhere. And behind that white man, a group of black men were picking up all the trash, the chairs, the tables, just cleaning up the mess that the white man made. And there was a lady, a black lady, who was speaking on a megaphone saying, if you're a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, don't participate in violence. This is a peaceful protest. When I saw that, everything just it was like things just changed for me. Things changed for me. It wasn't about the violent acts anymore. It was actually about the matter, the cause, and actually being an advocate and bringing awareness towards the root behind these violent acts. And that's racism. And let me preface, systematic racism and individual racism, because both of them are a problem. But let me tell you, I think systematic racism is more of a problem than individual racism, which people don't like to talk about. And then after I left, I actually went back and kind of placed myself in the midst of the protests, and I got to witness it. And I actually saw a lot of friends from high school, and it was great to just kind of be a part of that. And it was a unique experience. And from that experience, what I would say is, if you're white and you're nervous about like placing yourself in the midst of a protest, just go on the outskirts of it. You don't have to be in the midst of it. Just go and witness it from maybe a spectator perspective, and just see it for yourself, because I think it will stir something within you. It will stir something within you where eventually maybe you do place yourself in the midst of the protests. You're going to see things that you might not agree with. Yeah, I saw, some of the chanting that was going on. I didn't necessarily agree with it because there was hate, or I wouldn't even say hate. There's just a lot of hurt, and it kind of resulted in hateful language. But even though you might see the bad, you're going to see the good. And you're going to see especially for my Christian community, you're going to see God in the midst of it. His hand is over it, and he's in the midst of it. And it is a beautiful thing to witness. Sorry for the long response.
Oh, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I appreciate what you said about individual racism and systemic racism. Like, so coming back to that one, the way I see it, systemic racism does not stand alone. It stems from individual racism. Now, systemic racism is more serious because we find it in institutions that ought to be held to a higher standard, particularly the public service departments like the police department, the health, hospitals, medical field,
Yes.
governments, like
Yes.
especially those who serve the public.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you'll find bad apples in every sector of society, but there are some parts of society that you just can't tolerate a few bad apples. But it's so complicated because this conversation is so multifaceted that it's not just one thing, and that's part of the problem in my approach, or how I started to see this issue, because it seems to me more complicated than most people make it out to be. And sometimes I don't know if we can lay the whole issue of what happened to George Floyd, or the whole issue that we are talking about, at the feet of the police department as a whole. Because as many people have said, the 4 police officers who were involved, especially Derek Chauvin, was not accurate representation of the whole police department. But
it's good to have law, and it's good to have officers. You know, it's good to have those people in place. However, like you just mentioned, systematic racism does exist, very much so, in the law enforcement.
Yeah, and so there's just so much to that conversation that I don't know if we are touching on that right now, but
yeah, that's okay.
We can probably get back to it later, but it's just the way I see it is kind of slightly different. And so there's your diagnosis on what's going on, right? So,
and I'm sure there's so much more. There's so much more that I don't even know.
Yeah.
There's just so much more about it.
Yeah, but there's so much hurt that's going on, and as I've been praying that God would just open my eyes to see what's really the issue, and as I looked at what's going on, I see a lot of hurt, as you said, a lot of pain, and because this year started off really rocky. Like, first of all, the pandemic came, and that placed a lot of pressure on us. And then people started losing their jobs, businesses going bankrupt, as they still are. And it's like we've been stuck in this pressure cooker for the past few months, and all it took was this case of George Floyd that was the last straw that broke the camel's back, basically. And now we're seeing this explosion. And it's hard to see. And especially people being out of jobs, they have all the time in the world to do what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And they have every right to do so. And I think, and personally, I think, I think that it's going to be very good. I think protests need to continue. I wouldn't say rioting, because that does bring a lot more problems. But protesting, it needs to continue. It's just the thing about protesting is that far too often it dies out really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Really quickly.
Yeah, that's the issue we see many times. There's the protest and there's a call to action, but then once the sensation is over, it's back to normal.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
and it seems to be that cycle over and over again. And so the question is like, how do you make sure change happens?
Yeah.
and that's hard.
Well, I mean, you want me to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that in order for change to happen, there's going to be a lot of different things that have to be tackled. It's not just one thing. I think it's revolved around the Black community, but there's many different things that need to be tackled. For instance, the wage gap. But why is there a wage gap? Well, obviously there's individual racism, right? There's definitely that. And I think there's a lot more, I don't know, don't quote me on this. I think the statistics show that there's a lot more white CEOs. And it's so normal for someone to treat someone who's more like them with favor. And as a result, there could be a wage gap. There's wage gaps between the different races. So, but also, that's not the only problem. Why is there also a wage gap? Because the lack of education.
Mm-hmm.
But why is there a lack of education too? Because of geographical displacement. That is a result from history. Because from slavery to even the Jim Crow laws, basically it kind of placed the African Americans in close proximities and in areas where there's less opportunities, it's more impoverished, less health care, all these things. And basically what happens? They have a lot less opportunities, disadvantages, more health problems, more violence, less education.
It's a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop.
Absolutely.
Right.
And as you got to tackle that.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, it's way more complicated than just racism. It's like racism has a part to play, but it's just a myriad of other different factors in society that just feeds off of each other and creates this net, this trap that is very hard to break out of. And that kind of reflects the conversation that needs to be had. It's not just one conversation. And that's part of my, like, I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and I don't claim to be right and correct in what I think, but the way I see it, there are three conversations that are being had in this whole protest and this whole case. One being, first of all, there's a conversation about racism, and that's going everywhere. Like we can see that it's racism, not just in government, but in every level of society, individual to the collective. Mm-hmm. And there's a conversation that needs to be had, and I'm glad we're having it. But then there's the other conversation, a separate conversation about police brutality.
Yes.
Right. And that itself is a whole other problem because police brutality is not just on African Americans. You have brutality and killings of other white people, Hispanics, Latinos, and Asians. Oh. Like it's everyone. Not just, even though, and I did some research on how people are talking about the likelihood of a Black person being killed by a white police officer. And I personally am not satisfied with a lot of their metrics. Like, for example, they gave statistics on the number of people being killed by a police officer organized by race. And just that metric of being killed by a police officer or being brutalized by an officer, to me, that's not an adequate metric, because I'm pretty sure that there are instances where police brutality may be justified. And I think a better metric would be giving a chart where we see the number of people who have been brutalized by the police unjustly. And I think that would be a better reflection of the state things are in. And if I don't know if there's that chart, if people find a chart like that, they can just put it down in the comments.
That's an excellent point. It's a great point.
But I would love to see a chart like that. And if in that chart we still see the African American community being the top at the targeted people, then that's a big problem. That's a big problem. But but as I was saying, some of the metrics that are being used, I'm not entirely satisfied with. I'm not saying that there's not a problem. There is. It's just I would like to see it more clearly. So there's that issue, and people are having that issue. Like, people are pushing for more restrictions, restricting policies to be implemented in the police department, like, the whole debate on chokeholds and the use of force, things like that. I think those are great and that they are necessary, but they are only addressing the issue of police brutality in general. So we have the conversation of racism in every sector of society. We have the conversation of police brutality in general, regardless of race. But then we also have the conversation in the middle, where we talk about police brutality or the police department's relationship with the African American community. It's like a Venn diagram, right? You have this, you have that, and then you have the overlapping part. And that's a whole other conversation in itself. And part of the frustrating thing as I look through the news and what people are saying on social media, it's just really confusing because I see everyone trying to have all three conversations at the same time without distinguishing between the three. So you can have a conversation between three people. One person will be talking about racism, the other talking about police brutality, and then another person talking about the police and the Black community and their relationship to each other. And I think when they try to do that, it's just a mess, and there's not a lot of progress forward, because those are very difficult conversations by themselves, and you can't have them at the same time without having the understanding of how it's laid out, right? Do you see it that way?
Well, I was wondering, can you, for the video, mention those three different conversations again that are taking place but are very uncomfortable?
Okay, yeah. So again, number one, there's the conversation of racism in general, in like whether it's the top of society, like the government, or the bottom of the pyramid in everyday neighborhoods. Like, racism exists everywhere. So that's that conversation. And it's something that everyone on social media has been talking about, which is great. We need that conversation. And then we have another conversation about police brutality regardless of race, because we see that we see a lot of white victims as well, Hispanic victims as well. And that is also intertwined with what you talked about the web of societal issues that feed off of one another, and that's part of it. And here's the thing, not all police brutality is racism at its core, because there are also issues within the police department and how, how officers are being promoted, what are their metrics of success, how they're being trained, how much they're being paid, and all these different issues play into how police officers are carrying out their duties in public. So even though racism is a deadly factor in the police department, I don't think it's the only thing, the only cause for police brutality. So that's its whole issue by itself. There's racism and there's police brutality. And then we have this overlapping section where we have police violence that has racism at its core. And that seems to be, specifically for the case of George Floyd, that seems to be the case. But we're having all these three separate conversations that is very hard to, it's very hard to split them, because one person can be talking about racism in general, and then another person talking about racism specifically for one community with the police. And I think if you want to go far, if you want to progress far in our conversations, we need to be able to decipher what exactly we are talking about and work towards those goals.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of something that I have been kind of noticing, is that, and here's the thing, it's hard. We need a plan. We need a plan, but we can't really get to a plan without conversation. So back to what you're saying, it is very important that right now at the beginning stages that we have conversation about racism in all sectors of our society. The police department, law enforcement, the different practices and power, wages, whatever, all the things that kind of can result in unjust behavior. And then also the relationship between the Black community and the police department or law enforcement. These are conversations that we have got to have. But here's another thing too. I think that people need to really step outside of and this is this is particularly like who I'm talking to is the Black community, to feel the freedom, the empowerment to speak on behalf of your experiences, to speak about ideas you may have, and for those who are educated too about law enforcement, and also has a kind of like an inside view of governments and other sectors in our society, to really vocalize the areas where we're lacking and areas where we can improve, because it's through those voices that we're going to get to a plan. And one of the reasons why, and we all talk about MLK, we all talk about Martin Luther King. Why? Because he was such a mighty man of God that really helped bring change into our nation. But one of the things that I just admire about Martin Luther King is that he had a plan and he ran with it, and people were behind him and supported him. And I think the first part of this plan is protesting, but the plan has got to go beyond that. It has to get practical too. It needs to get even more practical, and it needs to be specified to the, like you said, the specific sectors in our society, specifically towards law enforcement, specifically towards the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community. We need to have practical plans and practical goals in writing, and where we're all aware of those goals and plans so we can come behind them, especially those who are outside the Black community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And that reminds me of a post I read by Barack Obama, of all people. Um, I read it on Instagram, and he laid out a few points, and I'm trying to remember the main points. One, he said, first he denounced the violent rioting. So he said that if you want to see good change in the world, you got to start modeling it first for yourself. And the second, he said, you got to go beyond the protest, as you said, go beyond the protest and bring it to the voting booth. And here's another thing to understand. The changes you want to see in the law enforcement is found in state government instead of the big overall national Congress and government, the president. The most impact for those departments are found at the state level, at the county level, the city level. And so that was another one of his points. So yeah, it's the importance of a plan is cannot be understated or cannot be overstated, because we can talk all day, but we really need a step forward if we are to see change. And this, I don't know if this is related, but I was just remembering about my initial approach when I first, witnessed this whole unfolding. When I first saw the video of George Floyd, the video that started it all, the thing was, when I saw it, I did not see primarily racism at its core. Like, the first thing I saw was not racism. The first thing I saw was an inhumane treatment of another human being by a cop. And so in my mind, immediately, yes, it's wrong. And the problem is, if you ask me what the problem was, I would say the problem is he's a bad cop and we need to deal with law enforcement. And then I saw everyone blowing up about racism and systemic racism combined with police brutality. And I kind of got surprised or a little confused because I did not initially see it. I did not see that it was racial at its core. So that was one of the big reasons why I was a little hesitant to kind of buy into the widespread narrative. And I'm still thinking about it, like, okay, is it possible that this case of George Floyd was racial at its core? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely? Probably. Do I know for sure? I don't know. I don't know for sure because from what I've read, I've not seen anything that says explicitly this is a racial issue.
Yeah.
Unless I'm reading the wrong articles, then you can point it out to me. Like, no, I don't know if it's obvious to you if that racism was the case.
I don't think that we know for a fact that it was like racism was at the core of this event, as you said, inhumane event, because it was just totally just a malpractice, just very bad.
Yeah.
However, the thing is, you can see that there is this stigma or this stereotype. No, there's a stereotype towards certain images of Black male and women, and we see that through media, through incidences that have occurred already, that have occurred in the past. So, like you said, we don't know if racism was at the core of this. However, it could. I think it is. I think that it might not just be at the core of it, but I definitely believe that it's a major factor. It's a major factor because of this racial stereotypes that we have towards Black men and women that are in certain areas, and participating in certain acts. Because here's the thing too, for instance, do you remember the name of the man who was shot by those two white individuals who
Ahmaud Arbery, right?
yes. Okay, so did you hear the calls that were made in the community? Wasn't there calls in the community? I don't know for a fact but there was, I personally think that there was like calls, if I recall, about a Black man being in a community where he wasn't supposed to be. Or at least, if there wasn't calls to the police department about a Black man being in a community where he wasn't supposed to be, we can totally see in the actions of those two white individuals that they believe that this is a Black man who was in a community where he wasn't supposed to be. And what happened? It resulted in the man's death. So that same like perspective towards Black men, I think, exists in a lot of white police officers. Not all of them, but I think that it definitely is something that does exist within a lot of police officers' perspective towards Black men and women.
Right. I definitely.
Does that make sense what I was saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I definitely agree that what happened to Ahmaud Arbery was definitely racism at its core. Definitely agree with that, and I just want to say that it is a problem that needs to be dealt with, and that just
but it's not the only problem, is kind of like what you are suggesting as well, or saying.
Right, it's one of the many problems, and it just added to the fire. It just added to the hurt and the pain that I'm seeing on a lot of people's face, on like who are at the protests.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I really sympathize with them. Again, I can't rightly say that I know what they're going through because I've not experienced what they're experiencing, but I can see the pain.
And I want to mention the word that I was trying to think of the word, but here's the word: racially profiling. That's a problem. That's what I meant when I was talking about stereotypes.
Right.
There's a lot of racially profiling. I've experienced it in my family, and I know a lot of white people have also experienced it in their family. And so that's that. I think that's like just a problem that exists with a lot of white people, not just police officers, but just white people in general, racially profiling the Black community.
Yeah, and that's a real thing. Yeah. So I believe it is a real thing. It's just that when I first came across this case, that was not the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah.
And that's probably exactly where my blind spot is, because as I said, I've only been in the US for like 4 years, and it wasn't as clear to me. But maybe for someone who has lived in this country their whole life, maybe it's so clear to them. And maybe racism was at the core of the case of George Floyd. Maybe it's not, but I'm still seeking to know for sure, and like whether or not it is. This is where we find ourselves, and racism is a real thing. Systemic racism is a real thing, and it stems from individuals. It stems from individual choices. And so I think that's the starting point. Yes, there's only so much we can do from the top down, like from a structural perspective. There's only so much we can do from a top down movement.
And that is going to probably be the most lengthy process.
The most lengthy process, yes. And I think the most effective way to bring about change is to start from the bottom up. It starts with the people. It starts with the individual. And yeah, and I think that leads us to the question of the role of the church in a time like this. Like,
yeah.
I don't know how much the church is speaking. It's hard to see the church in the middle of all this noise.
Yeah.
And so so I'm going to throw it to you. How do you think the church should rise up and lift the banner of truth in a time like this?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, it was a little laggy. So, well, I have to say, I really think that what I've witnessed, because I follow a lot of church accounts and a lot of pastors, what I've seen is a lot of pastors speaking up about this. Only thing about it is that, again, are they going to speak up for it just while it's popular? Are they going to speak up about it whenever it might not be the driving force of media? Are they going to still advocate and actually talk about it? So I think the first thing I want to say is that I think a good response and a good thing for the church to do during this time is to keep the conversation going. Figure out ways to keep the conversation going. Because again, like I said, it doesn't need to die out. It needs to continue. And that's one thing, because both of you and I both are graduates at Asbury University. It wasn't a conversation, one sermon out of the whole year, one chapel out of the whole year. It was a chapel that talking about racism was something that we talked about more than once each semester. And I love that about Asbury. And I think that actually kind of opened up my eyes and really helped me see how the depths of this problem. The thing about church is this, sometimes if they talk about it, it's only very minuscule, very minimal. Second of all, I think what churches need to do is to invite people who have experienced racism and know about ways in which we can go about this, and also are in Christ, because there's going to be a difference between, not necessarily, but there can be a difference between a Christian approach and someone who's not a Christian and their approach. It can be different, but it doesn't have to be different. Because I said in my video, I said, you don't have to be a Christian to see good and evil. You don't have to be. You don't have to be a Christian to be an advocate. You don't have to be a Christian to have a plan. But let me tell you, the best plan is a plan that flows from the heart of God and flows from Christ. But conversating and also having people who are educated and who have experienced racism to speak from the pulpit. Stephen Furtick had John Gray come out, I think, this Sunday. And basically, they had the way it was situated is that there was two chairs and they just talked. They talked. They had a conversation. And Stephen Furtick humbled himself, which is not always the easiest thing for him to do, even though I love Stephen Furtick. No, I'm joking. He humbled himself, and he didn't make it about him. He asked questions, and he let John Gray, a Black African-American pastor, speak. And he opened up his ears, and he opened up his heart and his hands, and his mouth towards what John Gray had to say. So them are kind of the two things that I think that are gonna really, help alleviate this issue from the church's perspective. But again, I want to just highlight this conversation cannot dissipate. It can't just go away. It needs to continue. And that's what was so great about Asbury University and our chapels, is that it was something that we talked about more than once each semester. and also having groups that and avenues people can join to keep that conversation going.
Yeah.
What about you? I'm curious about how you think the church is going to be able to tackle or be a part of this solving or helping alleviate this problem.
Well, the biggest thing we can do, as you said, is to speak up. To speak up. And I've been thinking, we've been doing a lot of talking. At least my ears have been filled with a lot of talking. And I've been wondering if that's the only thing we can do. I don't know what the proper term for this is, but it's like verbal fatigue, where I hear so much that I've gotten tired of it. And I think I think it is the role of the church to bring a fresh approach, to bring a fresh understanding. So that instead of people saying, "Oh, I'm tired of this conversation," or "I'm tired of feeling this way," it is. So I don't know. So to answer your question, there's God, in addition to the speaking of truth, which is of the utmost importance, because we cannot stay silent. And the church needs to give a voice to the people, but also ultimately a voice to the scriptures, a voice to God. Because we are hearing a lot of human voices, but we're not hearing a lot of God's voice. Primarily that comes through speaking, but that also comes through just how do you love people? I have yet to see a news article that depicts the church doing something out of love in a time like this. I've not seen it yet. Maybe I just missed it. But I want to see more accounts of Christians just being a beacon of love.
Well, the thing is, though, man, I mean, it's like, now I feel like I'm just talking to you like one-on-one. Now I feel like I'm talking to you face to face.
Go ahead.
It's like, that's why we got to lend more than just our mouth. You know, like first, in order for us to lend our mouth properly, we need to learn to lend our ears. And from lending our ears, not only are we supposed to lend our mouth, but this is a big thing. We need to lend our hands and feet. Got to lend our hands and feet.
Right.
I don't know exactly how to do that. Right. I know protesting is a great way to lend your hands and feet. Just imagine if a church body said, "Hey, we're going to go support these protesters," and they made an effort to bring their body of Christ, their body out to support these issues in protest. That's a way to lend your hands and feet. But I know there's so many more ways. I don't have the answers. But I really think that it would be very beneficial for the church to actually come along the Black community and listen and hear ways in which they can lend their hands and feet. Because that's what Jesus did. He didn't just go around preaching and teaching. He went around healing. And healing came from his hands and his voice and his feet and every part of him, from every member of his body. Jesus lent to the oppressed, to the sick, to the hurt, to lost.
And that needs to be the focus of the church.
Yeah,
because the root of the issue is hurt. I mean, we live in such a broken world that will be hurt all the time.
Yeah.
People will always get hurt because brokenness produces even more brokenness. It just expounds. And
we need to be remembered that racism, and I'm going back to just racism because, again, what you highlighted, and I think this is so great because you just brought me more of a fresh perspective as well. it's not just racism. It's also like improper practices that are within the police department. But I want to focus just on racism because that's kind of like where we're at right now. That's what we're talking about. However, we do need to talk about police brutality in a whole. But racism is not just a skin problem on the surface, the root, which Carl Lentz said. He's a pastor from Hillsong, and I don't think that he actually said this. I think he invited a black pastor to come and speak about this. He said racism is not just a skin problem, but at its root, it's a sin problem. And you know, if that sin exists in your heart, I just want to let everyone know. I'm letting myself know. If racism is in your heart, you are quenching God's love. You are quenching God's love. And also, I shared this with you before we entered into this discussion. Either in James or 1 John, the scripture says that if hate exists in your heart, the love of God does not abide within you. It doesn't say if hate exists in your heart, only partially the love of God abides in you. It says the love of God does not abide in you at all. So I take that verse very literally, and I take that very seriously. If there's racism, if there's hate, if there is anything towards my brother, my neighbor that exists in my heart, I got to get that removed. I got to get that removed because it is quenching, blinding, crippling the love of God that supposedly lives within me.
Definitely. So healing is our goal as a church. Like that's the thing we got to be focusing on. And the question is, how do we heal? How do we bring about God's healing to people? And I think we can find a very good example in how Jesus brought healing to the Samaritan woman, right? Like he was just crossing cultural and racial boundaries right there. And as I was reading through John chapter 4, which is the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, and just looking at how Jesus approached her and approached the conversation, he started off by putting himself at her service, or like asking her to help him. He's putting himself at her mercy. Give me water, I'm thirsty, right? He's inviting her to reach out too, just as he is reaching out. And then he gives her an opportunity to share, and he takes on the listening ear. And so that's the first thing he did. He chose to listen to her, open up a little bit about her life, and asked her more questions, and got her thinking about not just her physical need, but also her spiritual need. So he bridged the gap from being a social outcast. Like she had a physical need, but she also had a social need as a person who fell through the cracks at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Like she was despised. But before he addressed those issues, he crossed the bridge and addressed the question of where she is spiritually. That she is ultimately spiritually broken. And that needs to be the first step before she was healed socially and physically. And just seeing the transformation in the woman at the well is just very inspiring, because one thing I realized was she came to the well seeking fulfillment from the well, her physical fulfillment. And Jesus basically said, I want to put the well in you. I want to put the living well in you so that you can be the source of the living water, which is Christ, everywhere you go. And she ran back into the city. Like, she forgot all about her physical thirst. She ran back into the city. She forgot all about her status and the fact that she was a social outcast. And she spoke to the people saying, like, this man must be a prophet. He might be the Messiah. Come and see him because he did all these things and he said all these things to me. She was basically giving her testimony.
Yeah.
And it was a testimony powerful enough to bring the whole city after her, right? And so she started off being spiritually barren and hurt and just walking around with her head down. But she ended the story coming to Christ with all these people and all these converts. But just having that example of Jesus where he reached out to the person with a listening ear and an open hand, and also inviting that person to minister to him. Because you can't minister to someone who is closed up. And so by placing her in a position where she gets to choose whether or not to open her hands, then he can enter into her life too. And so for the church, yes, speak up for the truth. Like the Bible tells us all the time. Speak up for the oppressed. Stand up against injustice, the marginalized. Yes, have a listening ear and invite the other people to open their hands and say, you know what, I don't know everything. I'm as much in need as you are. So let's build each other up. And I know you're angry, I know you're hurt, and you're looking for healing. But healing starts on the inside, and healing starts when the well is placed in you.
And you know, it's really interesting as you're talking, kind of like what I'm seeing is, first let me ask you, give me simple answer, and I'm curious. As when you give us that, when you're sharing us that story about Jesus and the woman at the well, who do you see as the woman at the well? Who do you see? Do you see the Black community? Do you see the white community? Do you see the church? Because really, yeah, who do you see at the well? Who do you see? Because I know the answer is everyone, but who do you see?
Right now?
Because this is going to show about our different backgrounds.
More concretely, the black community, but a little more generally, the people who are hurting as a result of racism, not just the African American, but also the Hispanics, the Asians, the poor, those who fell through the cracks of society, those who have to walk around with their head down, those who have to scurry away in fear at the sight of someone else, those who try to avoid the public because, I don't know exactly who I see, but I see the people who are hurting. So in this case, currently at the forefront of my mind is the African American community.
So I totally see, that's awesome, because your perspective is so, like, I think is very correct. But for me, who I also see as the woman at the well is also the white community. And I see Jesus, in some sense, as the Black community, coming to the white community and asking for their service, for their hands, their help, to help get water, to help get water.
Mm.
I also see the white community as being poor, and there's many white people as being poor in their understanding concerning racism, concerning their sin in terms of like how to help. But see, whenever Jesus called out her sin, she didn't get angry. No, she didn't. Instead, she heard him out. And whenever the Black community calls out our sin, racism, a lack of caring, a lack of love, let's not get offended and say, oh, you can keep your own water and go off somewhere else. You can get your own water. No, us to acknowledge it, not to be selfish, greedy, arrogant, prideful, but to humbly accept the Black community when they call us out on our sin. So, because it's when we get into that posture and we humbly accept when the Black community calls us out on our sin, that we get to have our own testimony. We get to have a testimony. And then that testimony is meant to be heard. It's meant to be shared. That you had racism, but someone called you out and you came to realize that you had racism. And through the power of God and through your brothers and sisters, you were able to overcome it and share that testimony with the world, which empowers other white people to acknowledge their racism, their sin, and to overcome it and testify to their other white people, to other white people.
Wow, Houston. Wow. You're so wise.
No, you are wise, my friend. You are
because
wise.
You're absolutely right. Because if you're talking about spiritual barrenness and like emotional barrenness, social barrenness, just blindness in general. Like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And everyone, we all need our eyes to be opened. We all need hearts that are willing to, lay ourselves down, humble ourselves, and as you said, be open to correction. Be open to the voice of truth that calls out our sin.
And here's the thing too, and this is to this is to the Black community. Jesus came to her in love to share something that was going to change her life. He spoke the truth to her, but what led her to repentance was not her speaking in hate or anger. Which, let me tell you, if you have hate, anger, or hurt, let me tell you, I get it. I totally get it. But he spoke the truth in love, with kindness and gentleness. And as a result, she repented. I would say share the truth with us. Please share the truth with us. Call us out on our sin or racism. But do it in truth and love. You might not get all the responses that you want, but I can tell you, if someone doesn't humble themselves and turn away from their racism, they're not going to do it in kindness. They're not going to repent from if a person comes to them in kindness, and they're sure as not going to repent if someone comes into them with anger and hate.
Exactly. And see, I was just thinking that there are two kinds of people who are calling out for racial reconciliation and racial justice. There's the group of people who are demanding change to fit them, to fit their desires. And I think with that approach, it's very hard to bring about change. But as you said, there's this other group of people, and you're calling them to bring about change and correction, but with the intent of bringing about healing for the other person, right? So instead of me demanding you to accommodate to me or to treat me right, which you should, but instead of having that as the only message, it will instead be, Houston, you're seeing the world in a very broken way, and I want to help you heal your perspective of the world. And I want it for your good. Of course, it benefits me too, but ultimately I see you as the broken person. And I think, as I said, your insight into that story of the woman at the well is so insightful and so wise, because there's all this rhetoric that's going around about labeling the other side as the oppressors, as the ones who are evil, the ones who are wrong through and through, and that they need to bend their knee to us, the victims. There's all this rhetoric that's going on. And I don't think that's going to bring about any healing at all. That's just going to spark resentment. But the message that we are talking about is seeing the oppressors, I don't know why I'm doing that, but seeing the oppressors as people in need too, people who are blind. And that's the perspective that Jesus had. He was persecuted by all the Pharisees, all the religious leaders. He was persecuted. He can easily and rightfully say, they are the oppressors, they are evil, they better bend their knee to me. But that's not what he said. He said he was angry at them, and he had the right to be. But he also said they are blind. They are like blind men leading other blind men. And if only they are willing, if they are open, I believe Jesus definitely would have reached out to them if they were open, but they were not. And so again, as we look at the movements and the protests and everything that people are saying, I think there are these two groups of people. One that is demanding change for themselves, and the other group that is demanding change not just for themselves, but for the healing of the other person too, and for the wholeness, and so that God's love can be in their hearts, and so that their eyes will be open too. And that simple understanding changes the entire way you approach it. So yeah.
Can I share experience about
Go ahead.
Racism that I participated in? This is actually towards ethnicity specifically. I have two examples. One example with you, Nathaniel, and an example with one of my friends who is Latino. My freshman year, whenever I came to Asbury University, I asked my friend, and I was like, we're talking about our backgrounds. And I said, are you Mexican? You don't do that. You don't do that. And she said, actually, I'm not Mexican. And I was like, I'm sorry. But she didn't say, actually, I'm not Mexican, you jerk, and walk off. No, she said, actually, I'm not Mexican. And that's not really a good way to ask someone about their ethnicity. So at that response, I could have got severely prideful and said like, whatever. Or I could humble myself and say, you know what? Can you express to me how I can address further individuals about their ethnicity who don't appear to have the same ethnicity as me? And that's what she did. She said a better way to address someone is to ask them either if they're Hispanic or Latino. And here's another thing too. With you, I remember whenever I asked you, so, hey, are you from China?
Yeah, I remember.
And you're like, no, I'm not from China. I'm from Malaysia. At that moment, see, I'm getting red as I'm saying this. And being honest, it's quite embarrassing. But thank you, Lord, that I had gracious people who addressed me in my ignorance with love and truth. And actually now, whenever I address people, I don't even ask them, hey, are you Hispanic, Latino? Hey, where are you from? Usually what I say now is, so can you tell me a little bit about where you're born and raised? Because that can be a different state. It can be a different country. It can be anywhere. But don't just assume just because someone is Asian that they're from a different country. Don't just assume because someone appears to have a Hispanic or a Latino descent or Hispanic descent that they're from Mexico or that they're Mexican. And if someone addresses you in ignorance, like I did, can you speak a little bit about how someone can respond to someone who asks them ignorantly about their ethnicity or their race or their background or their culture?
So your question is, how
can someone like that, someone who doesn't appear, okay, so for instance, there's a lot of white people that will assume that if you have a different skin color or a different accent or something like that, a different feature that's different than them, that they're not from the same state or nation or area as them. So they might ask ignorantly where you're from, born and raised. If they do ignorantly, if they ask an ignorant question in terms of either your ethnicity or where you're from, how can you, with grace and love, respond to that individual?
Mm-hmm. Well, before I answer the question, I first want to point out that that way, like your new way of asking that question about, tell me a little bit about where you were born and raised. I think that's a superb question to ask, because so many people casually say, hey, where you're from? But by asking that question in a very intentional way, you're giving a message to the listener that you really want to listen, that you're really intentional and you really want to hear what they have to say, instead of a simple answer like, oh, I'm from here, I'm from there.
Yeah, and like, oh, great, cool.
Yeah.
And then go on.
Yeah, oh, great, cool, and you walk away. It's not like that. But by asking, tell me a little bit about where you were born and raised, that shows an intentionality that you're willing to stop at least for a few seconds, if not a minute, to listen. So that's great. Keep that up. As for someone who is different and how they should respond if they are asked an insensitive question like that.
Like I've done it multiple times. I've done it multiple times since being at Asbury University, and it's through trial and error, and honestly putting the pride to the side that I was able to realize, my ignorance my lack of understanding, to help actually become a more equipped, sensitive, educated individual, and fellowshipping and building relationships with people who don't look like me.
Yeah. So I would say just be gracious. And I know it can be frustrating. Like I remember my freshman year. That's usually the time when everyone asks me where I'm from, and I would get that specific question like at least 5 times a day. It can be very tiring and frustrating, but just having the grace of understanding that I had to try to come to a point of understanding, a lot of people here, they are not used to asking questions like these. Like the fact that they are asking is a big step for them. And so I appreciate people who I know are not used to asking questions of where you're from to take the step of asking that question. So I appreciate the effort. Sometimes I just let it slide. Like if they are really intentional and they want to continue the conversation, I will let them know. Like that, as the person said, there's a better way to ask the question. So I guess the main thing is have a little understanding and show grace to the other person. Because we all need grace. Like even as an international, like I've made so many mistakes, man, as an international. like I remember I unintentionally said something that was racially inappropriate, and I did not know it. And my friends were like, the people who were around, like, whoa, that's something. And I'm glad that they were gracious enough that they were very gracious to me. But here's another lesson that I learned. Like when I made that mistake, and I was like, what? Did I say something wrong? What did I just do? And they were like, don't worry about it. Forget about it. We understand. You don't really understand. You don't really know. Forget about it. But I did not let it slide. I was like, no, I want to know.
That's a good
like,
point.
Tell me. Like I know that you're kind enough to say that it's okay and forget about it, but I want to know because I don't want to make this same mistake again. So I got them to tell me what exactly the problem was. And since then, I never forgot. That was freshman year, and I never forgot.
Yeah.
So be intentional in, and something I really respect about you, Houston, is that you are always open to correction, and that you
correction.
But oh, so do we all. But you are very open to learning, and you're humble in that aspect. So I respect that about you. Yeah, just be gracious and be intentional in learning. And I guess that translates into all that we're talking about right now. It's hard to be gracious when you're angry, man. It's hard to be gracious when you're angry and you're tired of everything. You're tired of life and how the world works. But the call is to find a better way. And
so good, man.
I saw this video. I can't remember what social media platform it was, but there was this video at a protest, and there were 2 black men shouting in each other's faces. One guy was apparently he was involved in the the more aggressive side of the protest. I don't know, either he did something that was more aggressive, or he was on the verge to, and then he was shouting at this other black man who was trying to talk sense into him.
And he was 31, and the other man
Yeah.
was 60. I watched it. You posted on your story.
Yeah, and the other guy was like 43 or something like that.
Mhm.
And then the guy who was 31 brought in a 16-year-old boy, and he started saying, look, this guy is 40 something, he's 43, and he's still angry. I'm 31 and I'm still angry. You are 16. You better find a better way, because what we're doing, it ain't doing it. What we're doing ain't working. And like, as I watched the video over and over again, and as I looked at the face of that 16-year-old boy, I saw determination. Like, determination that, yes, we not only do we need to call for change, but the way we do it needs to change too. But I also saw a lot of pain in his face. And I know I can't say that I understand what he's going through, but I can see the pain on his face, and I felt it. That these are hurt people, and they're operating out of hurt, and hurt people hurt people. And so that call to, like, yes, I know you're angry, and I feel you, I stand with you, but let's work on this together and find a better way. Let's work on this together and do it God's way. The way of love, the way of healing, reaching out to the other side. Funny, because in the story of the woman at the well, Jesus started off hungry. He started off physically hungry, but after he reached out to the woman, he said, I'm not hungry anymore. Like, my food is to do the Father's will. It seems to me that he totally forgot about his physical need, because he was filled spiritually as a result of ministering to that woman. And so sometimes, I think sometimes, yes, let's not neglect our personal needs, but sometimes the next step is to reach out and to minister to another person. And maybe by doing so, you get filled.
I love it.
And it's hard because it's hard because you're the one hurting. And that's why it takes God's grace and God's strength to have the mindset of love and selflessness in a time when the only thing that you can think about is your own wounds. Not saying that it's not important to deal with your wounds, but there's more than that. There's more than that God wants to bring about.
A lot of people that I know we've been doing this for like over an hour now.
Oh, dang.
How long have we been recording?
It's been about an hour and a half, I think.
Wow, this is so good. This is everyone who's watching. If you're still watching after an hour and a half, probably not.
You're still watching. I salute you.
God bless you. But this is how our conversations go. This is how Nathaniel and I
all the time
fellowship.
But so, are you wanting to land the plane?
Well, so no, not yet. I was just going to say one last thing to kind of what you were saying. You hear from a lot of people, don't do to be to do. But here's the thing. Sometimes you got to do to be. Just like sometimes it's good to be to do. So although I'll just use the white community as an example. Sometimes fixing your own racism so that you can go out to support, lend a hand, and your feet, your heart, your eyes, your ears to the black community is not always the best approach. Sometimes, even if you have that racism, by lending your hands and your feet and your ears and your mouth and your bodies, the members of your body, first can actually help eradicate that racism. You just gotta deny the flesh, deny the sin, and choose to immerse yourself. And by doing that, that sin can eradicate. That's one approach. And then the other approach is also asking God in the secret place to take away that sin, to eradicate that sin. It's not one or the other. It's both approaches. Participate in both approaches. And I'm telling you, you will find healing in your life because, again, you don't understand how much greater your life will be as racism degenerates. It steals from the abundance of life. It steals from God. It steals from your brothers and sisters. It steals from so much. It's not God, and when it lives within you, it's just taking up space for God to increase in your life.
Exactly. It's a cycle. If it's another positive feedback loop where sometimes you gotta take the action and do something to result in a better and improved version of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result, as you become an improved version of yourself, you start doing better things, and it's a feedback loop. That's why
works both ways.
And it spreads. When you do one good thing, it inspires another person to do another good thing, and it inspires you, it inspires them. Sometimes you just got to take the action.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been great. This has been great for me too, because you gave me kind of more things to be watching out for, specifically just police brutality, malpractices in general. I think that what you highlighted out for me is that that's a big problem, that the answer is not to do away with police officers and law enforcement or laws. Because without laws and officers that enforce law, the people will perish. The people will perish. The nation will perish. But we need our officers to be more proper in their practices. And their practices needs to be seasoned with whatever results in better fruit.
Right.
So thank you, Nathaniel, for really highlighting that for me.
Yeah, like there's this structure that is necessary, that keeps us in order, but it needs to be constantly revising itself, renewing itself, and scanning through itself to root out the bad seeds, root out the malfunctions. The structure is important, but there needs to be a constant revision. And I think that's the role that all these protests are playing. It's the people are rising up to call the structure into account. And yes, there's the minority of people who are all about destroying the structure totally. But the right answer that I think a lot of people are going for is we need the structure, but we need to purify it. And yes, there will always be problems. That's why the people will always be here. The structure will always tend towards corruption. That's why the people will always be here to call it into account. And I think the first step towards a larger social change starts with the individual. And this is a very complicated conversation, as we pointed out. There's so many that is just interlinked, and it takes a long time to separate them out, deal with each one, put them together, and deal with that. Okay. And everyone is having a different conversation. That's why we need a clear mind. We need discernment. And so, but people are doing a good job, especially we are seeing a lot of news about the horrors of the riots, but we are also seeing a lot of videos about people who are praying, people who are doing good with in the protests. Some people are emphasizing even more police brutality in the streets. Others are emphasizing, there are good people in this system. And so it's just having a clear understanding of reality and then stepping into that with the voice of truth. So yeah, it's very complicated, very complicated. That's why we do it with tenderness and respect. Like as in I think it was First Peter 3:15, like always be ready to give an answer with the hope that's in you, and do it with gentleness and respect, because violence is not the way to persuade people. Like in Persuasion Class 101, the lesson is, if you want to persuade someone, you don't make them your enemy. You make them your friend.
Yes.
And to make them your friend, you say, I wish and I hope that you are on my side. But as a child of God, first of all, I'm on your side because I want your well-being too. And that's just a summary of what we talked about. Yeah.
Can I read just one passage real fast before we leave?
All right, let this be the last passage.
Yeah,
and
because I mean, we've been here for 2 hours. Man.
We've been here for way too long.
This is gonna take you 10 hours to upload.
Oh man, you see.
Unless you have to clip out some stuff, but I think that this is not just for the Black community at all. This is for both Black community, white community, whatever your race is. This is for you. Whether you're the one that's throwing the pass or the one that's receiving it, it works on both ends. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Though I speak with tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I've become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. It is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love never fails. And that's it.
And that's something for the both of us too, because we can talk about this all day.
Yeah.
We can talk about this for 10 hours straight.
Yep.
But if we are not doing something to tangibly love someone who is hurting, these are just words.
Yeah.
And people get tired of words. They're empty words. And so pair your words with actions.
Amen. Amen.
Right.
I think that's what everything comes out to be. I think that sums it all up. Is that don't just be to do, but do to be. It's both. It works both ways.
Yeah.
And it might be inconvenient, but that's okay.
That's okay. Many times it will be.
Yeah, that doesn't matter.
Yeah. So okay. So this almost 2-hour video will be on YouTube, and should we link the Revive page?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So guys, we have this Facebook page and an Instagram account named Revive, Restore to Life, where we seek to bring about healing and wholeness in Christ for the mind, body, and spirit, right? So I've got that up here. So we'll put those links down, and man, I'm so excited. Thank you, Houston.
I love you, bro. I love you, and I'm so thankful.
I'm so thankful for you. Like, this has been very rewarding.
Yeah.
So,
It happened.
all right. Thanks, guys.